After the American Revolution, several northern states took action to ban slavery outright, or gradually, including Vermont, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. These states all passed legislation to reduce, limit, or abolish slavery, and by 1860, the practice of slavery had vastly diminished in the North. Ironically enough, some southern states did take some action, including South Carolina. Thomas Jefferson wrote to the future governor of South Carolina, praising him for the state's actions on the banning of importation of slaves in 1787, so there was some sort of common ground at the time. Even though the importation continued to be banned, the South saw its slavery numbers explode over the next 75 years. This slave debate continued with the western expansion of the United States, particularly with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which prohibited slavery in any newly acquired territories that would then become states. When the Constitution was signed, slavery was permitted and slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person, so their population would not affect their electoral votes as much as they would have done by counting them as a whole. In January of 1808, the importation of slaves became illegal federally, but the internal slave trade continued. In 1820, a controversial agreement was passed called the Missouri Compromise. This was signed by James Monroe into law, allowing Missouri to become a slave state as long as no other territory state above it geographically could become one. Maine was added to the United States as a free state, continuing the balance of northern free states and southern slave states. This showed the country that lines were being drawn legally between the North and South, basically forming two different countries. At this time, the cotton gin began to maximize industry in the South, creating the need for more slave labor. The North began to implement protective tariffs that would help the manufacturing business owners more by taxing the South for imported and exported foreign goods, and it was a direct hit on its economy. The South considered the tariff of 1824 and 1828 unconstitutional, citing Article 1, Section 8, claiming these taxes to be not uniformly beneficial to the entire country, but only the North. This is the fundamental reason why the Southerners viewed this war as the Southern War for Independence, or the War of Northern Aggression. Jackson was in favor of these tariffs because he was one of the few presidents that paid off the national debt to the bank. This was one of his proudest accomplishments as president, and he viewed any rebellion against these tariffs as treason, and being the ex-general that he was, Jackson was eager to hang anyone who rebelled against the federal government. After the Tariff of 1832 was signed, the South Carolina legislators showed their first notable and official opposition to the federal government by adopting the Ordinance of Nullification, making these tariffs null and void in their state. On March 1, 1833, a new bill called the Compromise Tariff of 1833 was passed, reducing the tariff to somewhat sustainable levels for the South. But the nullification of federal law continued to be hotly debated. With the tariff situation at bay, the focus became the moral practice of slavery. Abolitionists were continually forming in the North, and the distinct northern and southern traits began to emerge. The North and the South were fundamentally different economically and culturally. The North relied heavily on manufactured goods and Wall Street, while the South relied on agriculture and farming. At the time of the Civil War, the North looked at the South as lazy, immoral, and uncivilized. The South looked at the North as greedy, money-grabbing, and immoral people. At this time, a religious revival was happening throughout the country, with different denominations interpreting their own views of the Bible, and the position of slavery was certainly at the center of the moral debate, with the Northerners looking at it as completely unjust, and the South justifying the act with their interpretation of the Bible. Slavery is obviously a touchy subject, with high emotions attached to it. That is why it's important to look at the hard numbers. By 1860, according to the 1860 National Census and the Historical Statistics of the United States in 1970, there was a population total of 31,443,322 people, which included 3,953,762 slaves. In the south, there were a total of 12,240,293 people. Of these 12 million people, there were 393,397 slave owners, comprising 3% of the population. Richer aristocratic white slave owners made up a majority of this 3%, and they did have lots of power in the respective legislatures. Although slavery was central to the Southern economy, the average white Southerner was poor and lived off the land and didn't own any slaves. Additionally, according to the 1860 census, the native nations of Choctaw, Cherokee, Creeks, and Chickasaw owned slaves. The Cherokee owned the most, with 2,504 slaves. Because of this, it would be natural for them to fight for their own interests, whether it was preserving their sovereignty or their own practices of slavery, so most of these nations sided with the Confederacy, while others supported the Union. When the Mexican-American War was ended in 1850, another piece of legislation passed, called the Compromise of 1850, allowing California to be admitted as a free state. But the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was signed, making it necessary for state government officials to help the federal government turn in runaway slaves. This once again made the North feel responsible for helping the trade prosper in the South. In 1851, a notable book was written by an abolitionist named Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book described the lives of slaves and changed the hearts of many about slavery if they were on the fence. This was a crucial turning point in the moral insight and revelation that everyday people had. Uncle Tom's Cabin would bring the issue of slavery to the front lines of politics, especially with the new state of Kansas that was at the center of this debate. The question lay in whether or not this would become a slave or a free state. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was signed in 1854, creating these new states, but the fate of slavery in them would be decided by the voters themselves, known as popular sovereignty. Both sides would persuade people to move to Kansas to increase their votes. This resulted in two different factions and even legislatures. In March of 1855, a pro-slavery government was set up and recognized, while the anti-slavery Free Soilers Party set up their own legislature and outlawed slavery. Tensions rose incredibly and violence broke out on May 21, 1856. Abraham Lincoln emerged on the scene as a star in politics. Unlike most of the Southern politicians who belonged to the Democratic Party, Lincoln was a member of the New Republican Party, also called the Grand Old Party, which was formed in 1854 by the former members of the Whig Party, who opposed the expansion of slavery in newly created states or territories. He was extremely vocal about his anti-slavery views, particularly in the expansion of it. In the Senate race for Illinois, Lincoln faced off against Stephen Douglas, losing the election but gaining national prominence. The Southerners began to see that if Lincoln could gain the office of president, a whole new strategy must be implemented. Although he did not want to see slavery expand, he was not necessarily looking to go to war over it, let alone emancipate those enslaved. About 1 year later, in October of 1859, John Brown was on the national scene again. Becoming one of the well-known abolitionists of the time due to his actions in Kansas, the tipping point for the South was the election of 1860, where all of the conflicts in the previous decades came to a head when Abraham Lincoln was elected 16th President of the United States. Lincoln was opposed to the expansion of slavery, as we covered before, but did not seek to eliminate slavery in the states where it was currently practiced. Lincoln felt as if he had no constitutional authority to do so, and he did not want to see it continue to expand into the new territories. The election of Abraham Lincoln on November 6, 1860, was seen as an act of aggression from the North by the South. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in most of the slave states, So Southerners were outraged when Lincoln won 180 out of 303 Electoral College votes. Aside from his views on slavery, Lincoln favored tariffs as well, so the 1820s and the early 1830s had the potential to repeat itself economically. South Carolina held the first secession convention on December 17, 1860, and 3 days later seceded from the Union. On December 22nd, Lincoln wrote a letter to the soon-to-be Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, which stated, "Do the people of the South really entertain fears that Republican administration would, directly or indirectly, interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves? If they do, I wish to assure you, as once a friend and still, I hope, not an enemy, that there is no cause for such fears. The South would be in no more danger in this respect than it was in the days of Washington. I suppose, however, this does not meet the case. You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub. It certainly is the only substantial difference between us." Still, the states continued to secede, and Mississippi joined South Carolina on the 9th of January, famously declaring, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. There was no choice left us but the submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin." Florida followed on the 10th, Alabama on the 11th, Georgia on the 19th, Louisiana on the 26th, and Texas on the 1st of February. Within these few months, the Confederate States of America was formed, all even before Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated officially as president. On February 8th and 9th, the Confederacy created their own government in Montgomery, Alabama, and appointed its president, Jefferson Davis. In the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, slavery was now protected under Article 4, Section 3. On March 2nd, 1861, in his last days as president before Lincoln took power, James Buchanan signed into law the Morrill Tariff, doubling the taxes, particularly on the South, from 15% to 37%, with increases up to 47% in the next few years. This was the last straw for the South, as they started to organize with the approaching new tariff-friendly Union president on deck. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln would be inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. In this speech, he once again declares his duties to preserve the Union and collect these duties or tariffs on the South by doing whatever is necessary if forced upon. In conclusion, there were many complex issues that led to this conflict. The right of states to secede from the Union, slavery, imbalanced taxes, two differentiating cultures, and the enforcement of tariffs were all contributing causes of the American Civil War. The new Confederate government was created in direct defiance of the federal government because they believed the Union was acting against the Constitution. This tension would start to explode as the final tariff bill was passed and Lincoln was inaugurated.